I had a friend come and stay with us at some point over the last year, and we were having a conversation where he said that he didn't like labels. And the reason was because as soon as somebody found out a label that they could put him under, he felt like they would just assume that they know everything about him now or about what he thinks. You know, think of the labels Calvinist or Arminian, or conservative and liberal, Democrat, Republican. And I think that's a valid point, that there is a sense in which people hear a label that you might put on, and they assume certain things then about you that they're just going to think of you as, and think that you think without actually ever knowing. They think that they've got you figured out once they have the label. But what I told him is, I'm not sure that the label is at all the problem. I think that the main problem is that we live in a time when the average person, probably due to the education system and the typical worldview, is unable to understand things in more than one category. So the average person just does not look past that simple one-word category and start to kind of make their way into the nuances of what a person believes or what they think. They can just boil everything down to that point. Sometimes I think of this as kind of bumper sticker thinking, right? We think in bumper stickers. We think in slogans. But do we actually have the capacity to reason in such a way that we know how to get down to multiple different categories of thought? Can we look at something from a lot of different angles and understand it in that way? I think that biblical wisdom requires basically the ability to see things from a bunch of different angles and then put all of those different perspectives and ideas together into one coherent worldview and thought. This is what I think you see in the wisdom literature of Scripture. You have things like the Proverbs, where you have these general rules of thumb. Hey, work hard, you'll do well. Right? Do this thing, it will go well for you. Honor your parents, here's what it will be. Raise your children up, and they're not going to depart from the teaching that you give them as they get older. These general rules of thumb that do seem to apply, at least in many cases. But then you get down to some of the nuances. You start to get into Ecclesiastes, and you say, well, everything is vapid. It's a vapor. It all passes away. And what is the point? You see that you can work really hard, and yet everything that you do will go to another, and you won't be able to enjoy it. That is the vapor of life. Everything, it's like a mist. It's like a breath. It's here and it's gone. It's somewhat empty. And then you can have the perspective of, say, a book like Job, part of the wisdom literature where Job seems to teach that things are not going well for Job, not because he was unrighteous. And think again to Proverbs, right? Here's these rules of thumb. You live in a righteous way, things are going to go well for you. You live in unrighteousness, well, then you're going to fall into the pit that you've dug. You're going to be running away when no one's chasing you. You're going to be falling into the violence that you're preparing for somebody else. That's what's going to happen to you if you're unrighteous. But Job falls into all of those things, seemingly anyway, and he does so because he's righteous. God explicitly allows those things to happen because he is righteous. Not in spite of it, but because he is righteous. And so you have to be able to take, and there's so much more than that, but just for the sake of the time here, you have to be able to take all of those different categories and kind of angles of thinking about a particular issue and put them all together to understand things. The problem that we have is that many of us are unable to think past one or two categories. Let me give you a more recent example. In the current time, we have all of these protests and rioting over these different deaths of black men when they are being arrested. Now, when you think in just simple one category, you could have the reaction to some of these things where you could think, okay, either you are pro-police, back the badge, 100%, whatever they do is great, or you are for Black Lives Matter and you hate that these black men died, and you want to fight for their right to life, and everything is put on that kind of binary choice. That's it, right? You're either pro-police or you are pro-African American community, and that is it. The problem is it's just not that simple. Thinking in multiple categories, you could say, you know what? There are some of these instances that the police are overly brutal, or they do things wrong, or they are too militarized and they're using too much force. They're using lethal force when it's not needed. Some of these laws are arbitrary and unnecessary. You can also then think, well, some of these men were criminals. They were fighting back. They were doing things that is going to put them in a difficult position, a position where it is likely that they are going to lose their lives. You can also think, wow, it is horrible that they lost their lives. Some of these situations where police are overly brutal, you can think, yeah, this was absolutely horrible. It was tragic. It was awful. Kind of restitution that should be made to that person's family. You can also, though, think, hey, rioting and looting in response to these things is also wicked and wrong and not okay. And you can just keep going, right? We can multiply the responses, but all of those things can be true at once. All of those things are different ways of looking at the same issue that can all be brought together in one coherent view of the situation. And I'm not saying that it's easy to come up with all of that, but the average American seems, anyway, and perhaps this is not quite true, but it does seem like most people are unable to distinguish those things. And this isn't just the liberals. This is also conservatives types, like I assume is many of the people that would be listening to me. It's very common for us. I call it knee-jerk conservatism, where everything we do is just pure reactionary to the left. Everything that we do is just reactionary to those of a liberal frame. And all we think is in those single categories of they did this, then we do this, right? They're protesting police. We're all about police, period. Well, maybe there's some nuance there that needs to be brought out. Maybe there are certain places in this country where the police are overly brutal. Maybe there are places where police departments even have a lot of serious issues that we need to deal with. Maybe there are some of these major progressive cities that need to be dealt with in a different way because what they're doing now is not working. That's perfectly possible, right? Just because the police where I live seem like they're doing just fine doesn't mean police everywhere are automatically great people. Also, just because there have been some instances where there is a man who is shot by police and it was wrong and it was not a good situation doesn't mean every single time this happens it's unjust or it's wrong. You don't have to be a knee-jerk conservative. You don't have to think only in kind of bumper stickers and slogans. What we want to do is apply biblical wisdom to the world and understand the nuance of life. Sometimes I think about this like it's like a tree. If you stand way back and you look at a tree, it looks like this one thing, right? Here's a tree. But you start getting closer, and what you see is, okay, well, the tree, there's more to it, right? There's the leaves, and there's the branches, and there's the trunk of the tree, and you have the bark on the tree, and all these things are a little bit different, and they have different purposes, and then you've got the roots that go down, and if you take a magnifying glass, you're going to start to see even more little intricacies to this tree. And if you take a microscope and you look down on the microscopic level, things are going to look, again, even more details are going to emerge. And if you take a step back and you just walk backwards, you're going to see that all of a sudden this tree is actually part of a whole forest and a whole ecosystem, and it plays this role in this whole thing. And so, like, one simple tree is a simple thing, and yet there is so much more detail that can be understood, whether you go deeper, whether you take a step back. Either way, you're going to see that there's much more to the story. That's how we need to think about basically everything. And that doesn't mean that labels or categories or bumper stickers aren't helpful. They can be helpful. They are the kinds of things that are helpful when you have a more immature grasp of things. You think about when you're a kid and you're growing in knowledge, you learn these big category ideas in which you then start to learn a little bit more nuance about different subjects. You learn about trees, for instance, but then you start learning, and there's different kinds of trees. There are maple trees and oak trees and elm trees, and you start to learn a bit more about the diversity and then what each of those has that are kind of a little bit different, and the different kinds of oak and so on and so forth. Categories are helpful in that case. These broad categories are helpful in distinguishing things, but they only are useful to a certain point, and we need to carefully use those categories as they should be used. We should use them as a simple starting place, but not allow ourselves to just assume something once we hear a category. Once we hear somebody say, well, I'm a Calvinist, I'm an Arminian. We shouldn't just then assume, okay, well, I've got them pinned down. I know exactly what they think. I know what they believe completely, and just assume things. We can use that as a help, as a guidepost, but then we need to continue on in getting to know what somebody actually believes, especially when we're interacting with them on an intellectual or relational level. You need to understand who someone is. So we want to be able to think biblically, in other words, in multiple different categories, all at once, bringing all things together with that biblical worldview that allows us to think through all things coherently. Hey everyone, thanks for listening today. If you have any questions, concerns, ideas, problems, anything with what I just said, feel free to reach out to me. My email is pastormichaeljbowman@gmail.com. You can find more information about Christ Covenant Church, where I pastor, at ccc-pca.org. And if you're in the La Crosse area, I would love to get together and talk more in person. All right, bye.